and appealing to a boycott of fast food places to get those people to agree to pay 1 cent more per tomato. And that's like, I mean, per pound, I guess, per pound, it would be 1 cent more per pound. But anyway, that was amazing. And there was, in that system, a margin for error that you could raise the pay of the workers, and you could, people selling the stuff could still make a living. The problem with small farmers in the state, here for instance, is that there was a very interesting book, the authors I've forgotten, but a book about New York farm workers. And the reality is that if the farmer is going to make a living, there's such a narrow margin that if they pay the workers a really good wage, they're probably all going to go broke together. And that's because we're not paying enough for food. And everyone always brings up, whenever you talk about this, people say, oh, but the poor, that's really nonsense. Who's feeding the poor, right? I mean, they're being taught to eat this junk the way everybody else is, and this junk is very expensive junk that we're getting. I mean, if you really look at the difference in cost between a Coke and an orange, right? I mean, a Coca-Cola is not cheap, but an orange doesn't have the marketing power behind it, right? So we have been taught to buy these processed foods which make all their money by the margin between the raw material and what you get by putting in all this other stuff that you think you're getting convenience. And I have to say, as someone who cooks all my own meals, convenience is an illusion. I mean, it takes me no more time to make a dinner than it takes me to heat something up from something I buy in the market. You know, it just doesn't. So we just all have to come to understand that food is so fundamental, and that we're not, and that we need to pay for it. Otherwise, we're never going to have justice, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about your question. It makes me think about relationships, and like I just kind of speak from my own experience in that, like, in this work, and in those kind of categories of food justice, like I was talking about, like, really coming into a relationship with the land and like the livestock we have, and to hear you talk about a couple of things, like, that the power of observation, and like, really getting to know, I feel like, over the course of my time at Stony Point Center Farm, like, I'm getting to know this land. I hope this land is getting to know me. I mean, like, I really think that, it's the start of what I hope is like a long relationship. And I think that as you make those connections, like, I mean, hearing you describe, like these campfires and this like beautiful life, it's like, something, I mean, I really think something like magical can happen when you really start to pay attention to these relationships. And that also comes, like, and I think about in our community, in the community of living traditions, people bring these gifts of, a real concern for other people and for justice, and I think about like all this description of how wonderful it is to be happy when you're in connection, when when you're growing your own vegetables and eating your own food and fueling yourself in that way. It just makes me think of like everyone has that right, and when we're like when people don't have that, I mean, I come to believe, I mean, it's this idea that if one person is suffering, we're all suffering. Like, I mean, and I think that goes beyond people. I mean, like, when life is suffering, like, things aren't right. And so, for me, like, the connections with the land and with and with other people in my community have like led me to broaden my horizons, and I get inspired by the work that that the people in our community are doing, and people that we come in contact with. And so, I think that like, the tension that you speak of like, if you go and homestead and just kind of like decide you're going to be self-sufficient and you close yourself off from everything else, I mean, what is that really? I mean, like, yeah, like you, one person can be happy, or maybe a family unit can be happy, but I think that, I think we owe it to the community of life to think beyond that. I really do.
So I have a question. The question I have, what I'm seeing now is that a lot of young people are going into farming, which is sort of new, because we used to have lots of people in farms. They all left the farms. my parents grew up at family farms. They both couldn't wait to get away from the farm because it was a very hard life. So now we're trying to recreate farms back in the community. And I guess the question is, how do we create a lifestyle that's sustainable so that people actually want to continue being farmers?
This is a really critical point. I was just reading Elizabeth Henderson the other day, and she's a longtime farmer in upstate New York, and a brilliant woman. She was a Russian scholar, and her fiancé was killed in an auto accident. She dropped it all and became a farmer. She's a brilliant woman, and she writes, she's very important in the Northeast organic food movement, and she said, we still haven't got a life pattern for farmers that's sustainable. I mean, I know young people, young couples who are living in a trailer and growing food for a CSA. They don't have hot running water. They're not going to do that when they're 45. And they don't have any retirement. They don't have health care. Well, now maybe they have health care. Maybe they can afford to buy it. But they don't have any security. And that's what we have to do. And so we have to think much more broadly than just...
Right. Yeah, we do.
I don't know what the answer is. I ask myself every year when I have to sit down and renegotiate my position. You know, how am I going to, in Rockland County, support myself, support a family? I don't have the answer yet, but I do know that we have to start to ask ourselves these questions, and we have to start to formulate the answers, because the average age of an American farmer is 65 or above. When that generation of people are gone, who is going to continue to grow our food? And we're still going to have to eat. That's the first question. The second question or issue. The second issue is, again, in Rockland, the average price for raw land is $50,000 for raw land, average. So what young farmer is going to be able to afford that? And then the third part of this issue, I think, is then on what land? What quality of soil? What quality of water? It is complex. It is incredibly complex, as Joan is saying. The breadth of the issues is immense.
And what we're doing now is we're externalizing the costs. I mean, right? I don't know if you know this, but there's parts of North Carolina and the South that are largely black or Hispanic. That's where we have the hog farms. That's where you have the hog farms that are so polluted and so noxious and so terrible that people can't even live around them. They can't go outdoors because the smells that come off them are so bad. And Smithfield was just bought by a Chinese firm, and China is growing its pork here on the backs of the poor blacks in the United States because it's cheaper than to do it in China. And if that doesn't tell you something about where the American food system has gone to, I mean, and because hogs use so much corn, we've now turned over most of our corn acreage to China implicitly because they're going to use that corn to grow hogs to send back to China. It's a system that's so insane that 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I thought this can't go on. You know, this is going to collapse, this system. And the amount of money that pushes it in a single direction, the amount of power that is exerted over nature to keep nature in check is scary.
A similar sort of unknowable kind of response is the climate change response. If there are billions of people who are going to be forced from where they live by rising oceans further inland, then the plan as to how one engages the inland in that migration and resettlement. Again, China is probably thinking more deeply about these issues, and India, than we do, and have for a long time. And then secondly, you have the strand of the Land Institute, kind of the work of Wes Jackson, who reminds us that the earth produces sustenance in ways that are quite different from the ways that we have come to use the land to produce food, and that the monocultures are one of the more rapacious uses of land. So if we think big in response to that question, rather than we also need to think small, we need to be even now creating plans that will engage the the global scale of the movements of people. I mean, right now we see these as refugees driven out of Syria, in part by an extended drought. We have Californians who are or are thinking about relocating as a result of climate change. It's not beyond the scale of our capacity to engage that question in a larger way, given what we now know. I was reading today Wes Jackson's Becoming a Native of These Places. These are works that are 40 and 50 years old. We've known this is coming for actually centuries, for 3 centuries, but we actually have the tools to respond to it over the last few decades. And we have to have people asking the right questions in order to pursue the productive answers to those. But I really do think that the challenge of migration, it is population, it is migration, and it is how you move people from the way we engage with the land today in urban and non-productive to the periphery. The periphery keeps moving back. I mean, it's the shamans and the farmers and the others who've always led us across that threshold into using those resources in new ways.
Well, I think part of the answer is educating people as to the cost of food, as you were saying, and getting people to understand that the cost of food is more than what they think it is, and that it's reasonable.
And we're really paying for it. We're paying for it in taxes and health care.
Ways. But I have to tell you an interesting story. My daughter, who's 12, was in a class the other day, and the central point was made that people who spend money on organic food must be really wealthy. She came home and said, Mom, you buy all organic food. My teacher said, you must be, really rich to buy all organic food. And I said, no, because it's a fallacy. Because people think, number one, that organic food is really expensive, and in reality, it really isn't. But it's also, so there's an educational process.
For sure,
Yeah.
for sure. Our shares work out to less than $30 a week. You couldn't even go to a store and get what we offer. Freshly picked when a fruit and vegetable is supposed to be, not ripened on a truck or who knows what. With no chemicals, no pesticides, grown by people making reasonable money. And in your backyard, you couldn't even pay for it, yet we are struggling to fill our shares. And how is that possible? I think education is very much part of the key to these answers, and from beginning, from the children, because they're all being marketed to, they're all being educated as well, and those are the people that become the decision makers.
That speaks to my question. Is this group here basically is the right of the age curve, and it's the younger generation that you want to reach. Very honestly, when I think of gardens, I think of the Italian retiree who does it as a hobby, not with any social justice or anything. And what you all said tonight was very impactful in that it really gave a full circle in what a greater value for what food is and what goes into it and who it impacts. And I can remember my children are only 20 and 22, and I remember going into their books in school, in high school, you'd see the big combine moving food. And the message I remember in high school was, we're just smarter now, we can do a lot less farmers because we have the technology and the pesticides, and we can just grow more. And to be honest, that's what I walk away with. Do you get the opportunity to come in and impact children, maybe not second grade, but third, fourth, fifth, or sixth grade, to maybe leave an impact on their mind, that when they do look at something and they do go to the supermarket, they may see it differently. Because you think of Whole Foods, the store, in Wall Street they call it whole paycheck because it costs so much, just like Linda said.
Actually, I'd like to jump in for a second here. So, you know, we're here speaking, we really need to reach the young people, and we're speaking with the older generation, and over here we ask the question, you know, there's a lot of young people want to get into farming, and how do we make it sustainable for them, you know? And as we're speaking to an older generation, you know, really we're looking to you right now to support that younger generation, you know, because the older generation has worked and accumulated money and wealth, and the younger people are getting into this thing with none of that. You know, they're just beginning. You know, they're going into college and they have debt and all this stuff. So it's actually really difficult for a lot of young people to get into this, you know, especially if they don't have land and they want to buy land, unless they want to just go and work and be a part of some already established, you know, farm, right? But we don't need, we do need that. Farms need more help, but we also need more farms. You know, we need to start creating more of those things. So really, like, how do we, how does the older generation going to step up and serve the younger generation? You know, how are we going to start pouring our energy into the next generation? You know, that's really important that we, as I'm not an elder nearly at all, but you know, how do the elders and the middle age and all those grown-ups get together and start having this discussion of how are we going to step up for the next generation, because we want to encourage them to be earth stewards. And we haven't done such a good job of being those earth stewards. But we, you know, when are we going to have that conversation with them and say, hey, y'all, we left you a big mess, and what can we do for you? You know, how are we going to do this for you? It's like crucial right now that we really like start to have this conversation amongst ourselves and with our communities out here. How are we going to support this generation in the environmental mess that we've created for them? How are we going to, you know, empower them to have the best practices available and to have the resources available to live that way? And there are a lot of examples of people that are creating sustainable communities and eco-villages and farms that are sustainable, but it's very difficult oftentimes to start something, you know, unless you have money backing you, right? So why don't we find ways to do that for our generations? Because there is an increasing demand in organic food, and you know, and herbal medicines. There's plenty of niche markets out there and ways that we can grow cash crops that actually can sustain us. You know what I mean? It's not easy if you have, you know, less than an acre of land to start a business that way. You can feed yourself, and that's great. That's a place to start. But if you want to, you know, be more sustainable and support a community, then we have to really, you know, there's ways to do that, right? But it's hard to get it started. So we need to be aware of that, put those tools in our younger generation's hands and say, hey, look, you actually can go out and make a living. You can, here's plenty of examples of how you can get into this beautiful lifestyle, provide for yourself. I mean, what is wealth anyway? You know, if you have land and you have health, then you're wealthy. You know what I mean? So that's sustainable right there. Let's get this land for these kids. You know, let's create more places like that for them. And the
Max?
are sustainable.
So this has been very enjoyable, very thought-provoking. And I'm thinking to 150 years ago, when I'd say like 90% of the population were either farmers that lived on farms. And they practiced exactly what you're discussing. You know, organic farming. And then 70% of the people lived on farms, and then 40%, and then 30%. And now 1.5% of the population feeds the entire population, where it took 90% before. We're not going back to that. That's not happening. I don't see a mass migration back